Hello everyone, for today's presentation, I'm going to talk about the infamous Chinese pirate Zheng Yisao, and mainly focus on her historical and literary image, and how the latter influences this figure in secondary works. So here is the content for this presentation. I will first talk about her literary image with a brief summary of her story, and select 3 typical events in her life to discuss. The second part is her historical image, consisting of an introduction to the sources applied in this presentation, and most importantly, a compare and contrast between Zheng Yisao's literary and historical image. At last, I will talk about the effects of the literary image on secondary works, and provide some possible reasons to those impacts. So first, let's talk about the literary image of Zheng Yisao. She appears as a literature figure in Borges' story, The Widow Cheng Lady Pirate. It is a historical story included in A Universal History of Infamy, which tells the story of Chinese female pirates, which is known as the Widow Cheng. It covers a series of her life events, starting from her husband's death and end with her surrender to the government. Thus, we can chain her life into 3 typical events. First is her husband's death. After that, Cheng took over his power and commanded his sizable crew. Second, she set a series of strict regulations and effectively improved her crew's work ability. And lastly, after losing a battle, she surrendered to the Qing authority. These 3 typical events will be discussed in the next part, which is the historical image of Zheng Yisao. To start with, introduction of the primary sources is necessary. This presentation will mainly focus on 2 pieces of primary sources. The first one is Jinhai Fenji, also called the history of pirates who infested the China Sea from 1807 to 1810, when firstly translated by Charles Fry Newman. It is a record of piracy in Guangdong during Jiajing period, and it is one of the very limited primary sources about Cheng Yisao. And the other one is Pirates of the South China Coast, 1790 to 1810. It is written by D.N.H. Murray, with detailed description of piracy activity and its related figures in Guangdong province. And now, I'm going to discuss the deviation of the literary image and historical image through the 3 typical events mentioned before. The first one is, after Cheng's husband died, she took over his power and commanded his crew. In Borges' story, it is demonstrated that Zheng Yi, husband of Zheng Yisao, is poisoned by his shareholders, which is written in a rather dramatic tone. However, in history, the description of this event is completely different and also simple, saying that 正一为飓风所沉, which means he was accidentally drawn by a typhoon. The second event, through strict regulations, Cheng effectively improved her crew's work ability. According to Borges, all the regulations about deserted crew, robbery, and women harassment are set by Cheng. While in history, it was her adopted son, Zhang Bao, set all 3 regulations. This deviation might result from the frequent omission of the subject in classical Chinese, which might be misleading for a lot of foreigners and translators. The third deviation comes to the end of the story. It is said that after a fiasco, Cheng surrendered to the Qing government. The tone of this plot is also dramatic, saying that Cheng kneeled for the authority and asked for confession. In history, however, Zheng Yisao surrendered in a rather presentable way, with government rewarded all of those surrounded crew and asked them whether to fight for pirate with the navy or back to their home and farm. And also, beside those major deviations, there are also other minor deviations appear in this story. Here are two of them I believe worth mentioning. One is the plot of Zheng Yisao and her crew defeated Guo Lang, which refers to a general then in Guangdong Navy called Lin Guoliang. In story, after his navy crew was defeated, he committed suicide. While in Jinhai Fenzhi, it was Zhang Bao's crew killed him abruptly and with no evident reasons. The other is a cultural inversion between story and fact. Borges wrote that it was the migration of villagers forced the pirate have no idea but robbing foreign merchant ships. However, according to Murray's study, the truth is quite the contrary. Pirates used to bring goods from robbed foreign ships to villagers and did no harm to them. It was a strengthened policy that made pirates had to plunder coastal villagers for survival, which is also a damage of the balance between the villagers and the piracy. The deviation between stories and the fact bring huge impact on the secondary works about this figure. Those works misleadingly based on Borges' story rather than historical facts. Plus, those deviations especially focus on the part of Cheng's set of regulations. Here are three secondary works I found about Zheng Yisao, and it is easy to recognize all of them mention things like her code or her rules on the crew. It is also worth noting that in all three works we can say like the rape of female captives and strict code and allocate of women's rights. So it can say that in all three works, the forbidden on sexual harassment is mentioned. So from this phenomenon, I believe there are two possible reasons. On one hand, here are limited primary sources on this figure. It is mainly because, firstly, China as a continental state has almost no attention on things like controlling piracy and the attention to the navy. Plus, it is also a result that in Chinese literature there's almost no space for piracy, which means that it is not as highly romanticized as it is in Western literature. On the other hand, this setting also shows a favor of feminism from authors. There's no doubt that Zheng Yisao as a historical figure with high particularity in identity. She was a former prostitute, a female pirate, and a so-called policymaker on rejecting insult to women. Although the last introduction is not so true in history, setting like this naturally appeals to supporters of feminism, which also provide the reason why Zheng Yisao appears most frequently in works reflecting a feminism tendency. So here are all of my works cited and bibliography. I hope you like my presentation today, and thank you so much for your listening.